We live in an era when no oppressed people will be satisfied to let the oppressor continue to oppress them without doing something about it.
Paul Robeson is forever relevant in my life. First time I really knew about him is my father, both my parents were in choirs and quartets, so I grew up in a singing family that sung every evening, and the male voice quartets and male voice choirs that my father was part of really had the same resonance. And I remember him speaking about him. My father was a bass singer, so the bass baritone resonance, I could really understand the spiritual, social, psychological and emotionally intelligent aspects of singing, and how that awakens the creative principle in us all. And it is that creative principle that I find the most compelling aspect about Brother Paul Robeson, because the creative principle is responsible for that which can liberate and give value to all beings and all life, but it also can have a maniacal component to it, and the very systems which Brother Sukant has spoken about were mused and began innocently and began as let us go forth and venture. And within that creative impetus comes meticulous study of how to manipulate laws of nature, human instincts, organizational structures and cultures to create systems which on one side appear initially benevolent, but then can very quickly rid us of our freedom and liberty for us to believe that we're extending paternal, parental, communal instincts into a statist, militarist construct. The interesting thing there is the emotional and psychological attachment. We all begin with some sort of family, some sort of community. And within that, we do learn about power dynamics, about positioning. We do learn about punishment and reward. We are in some way introduced to a Pavlovian dynamic, carrot and stick. We are educated in particular ways that socialize us to seek compliance and esteem of those we consider to be authority. And I'm making no comment either way about the virtues or lack thereof of those protocols, only to suggest that those very same emotional and psychological protocols that are based upon our socialization education can be easily transferred into a statist construct whereby a government or a nation state becomes our parent, and we lend the same emotional ties and seek the same need for approval and for esteem, and will do whatever we can to avoid the punishment that may come from not being compliant or in agreement. But for Paul Robeson, there's a very different character here, and he would often say that he wasn't really, his activism in a way we're seeing the social impact of a spiritual activism, which is at the heart of his character and is in the heart of his art and music making. It isn't because he wants to be necessarily a charismatic leader. It is simply that his volition, that there is a power within that propels him to make right and to create cultures and conditions where all can rise, and an absolute razor-sharp belief that somewhere in that mystical art of music and theatre that one could neutralize or re-engineer those who may be the enemy in a particular situation. That through hearing particular tones or being exposed to a message rendered aesthetically, that it could change a heart and change a mind. something is interesting with the creative principle, because it has the imagination that is going to imagine that which is not yet. That which doesn't yet exist, the artist believes it is possible to create and externalize. The artist becomes, at some points, dangerous for this very reason. We've all been taught to follow a doctrine, to follow the script, to be compliant or to be punished. Then eventually we assume that what is being constructed, propagated, perpetuated, and given legal gravitas and statist position is that which is natural, that which has always been, but never that which was dreamt up by some self-electing authority that could use violence, ultimately, to get their way. The artist has a way of intuiting first principles of possibility, that they too can connect with the muse of possibility and externalize in a way which is emotionally intelligent and spiritually directed into a rational and actualized structural possibility. And that is the interesting consciousness of the artist, that having an ability of what one might put within the magical realism of the spiritual mind and consciousness is able to then put through a rational deductionist process to bring that into form, to see the codes and structures by which we may become our own grand architects of civilizations and cultures. So as we struggle, and as Paul Robeson struggled, and all of those before him, really having much to do with the 1860s, in a way, a new movement had catalyzed, which went back further. In fact, if I look at Dutty Bookman and the likes, who were collaborating and catalyzing the movement in Haiti, about their liberation, that they began to think about nations and states and power structures. And that dream eventually fermented at a time when revolution in the 1870s began to rear its head. But also with that, men working on ships around the world was an incredible time. In 1870, you can imagine, well, the 1880s, in fact, but 10 years after the Communist Manifesto had been published, that workers on ships at night would be reading to each other in different languages, and they were having a chance for fellowship and brotherhood, and to realize that they were sharing the same suffering and the same circumstances, and that perhaps the same oppressors had rendered a vernacular of control, nuanced by their national culture and political structure, but nevertheless a grand architecture of oppression, which has somehow nuanced itself across nations. And that created a very interesting dialogue between people of many different cultures and faiths. It's from this same period that the likes of Noble Drew Ali, and who then becomes a founder and the mentor Fard Muhammad for the Nation of Islam, but the likes are on these ships learning and exchanging, as is Marcus Garvey is on these ships, as is Howells and the founders of the Pan-Africanist movement. At that point, the idea of a superstate concept had had some influence on the concepts of the United States of Africa as a federal bloc. But I say federal bloc because, once again, people were creating possibilities based upon what they knew at the time, and on the assumption that the same blueprint could be wielded to their own ends. I'm told I have 1 minute, I have gone on forever. Must enact and assert the creative principle in ourselves, and that can only be expressed as a sense of sovereignty, we are not thinking for ourselves, someone is thinking for us. We are not simply to be a fellowship of followers, but co-creators and co-inventors that use our uniqueness to find our way of not simply struggling against structures which have been in place by those who have spent a great deal of time finding ways to devalue other human beings. We must be also the creators that give birth to the possibility of how humans and all beings may rise, thrive, and flourish in abundance. It is incumbent upon us, therefore, to not cease from mental flight in this endeavour, and like the tenacity of a great Paul Robeson, to use mind, will, activism, and the aesthetics of art and beauty and fellowship of human beings to make that a reality. Thank you.